So I'm gonna take off a little bit where John left off, and it's important to conceptualize where Lenin is writing and acting. And basically, as John mentioned, he's often marginalized. But you also have to keep in mind there are these titanic figures, and I mean that in all senses of the word. These titanic figures of Marxism who are accepted as the orthodoxy. And John, of course, talked about Plekhanov. Plekhanov was the Russian titanic figure in which everyone deferred to him. Everyone believed that because he brought Marxism in a substantive way to Russia, was the proper way to go. And everyone looked to him. And so in order to, and this is one of the great tragedies of Lenin's life, in order to break with the terrible policies of Plekhanov, Lenin had to break with Plekhanov proper. And the other major figure in Marxism at this time is Karl Kautsky from Germany. And he received, if I'm not mistaken, he directly received the inheritance of Marx and Engels' entire works. Either it was through Bernstein or he received them directly. But along secession, he was the inheritor of all of the works of Marx and Engels. And internationally, everyone agreed with Kautsky. He was the accepted orthodoxy. And he also was a titanic figure in worldwide Marxism. And of course, the reason being is Plekhanov was not willing to move forward with revolutionary insurrection, the seizure of the state, party discipline. And Kautsky was not willing to move forward in denouncing imperialism, in denouncing World War I. And as a matter of fact, Lenin constantly said, the most famous, right? So let me sort of give an example. He wrote an essay called Marxism and the Renegade Karl Kautsky. To sort of make it a little easier to conceptualize, this would be like Denis Kucinich writing the Democratic Party and the renegade Barack Obama. Right? You're dealing with the main figure of Marxism in Europe. And he writes this polemic saying that Kautsky is, he doesn't use the term revisionist, but an opportunist, an economist, that following his policies will disintegrate the international movement. And as a matter of fact, as John said, when World War II started, it did. Or, sorry, World War I. Freudian slip there. So what happens is Kautsky and all of these other European Marxists support the war, essentially. And they say, oh yeah, this is an imperialist war, but we should still defend our country against aggression. And Lenin says no, absolutely not. So much so that they literally have a term for it, and again, John alluded to it, revolutionary defeatism. This is literally the position of Lenin, is we should actively do whatever we can do to make sure that Russia loses the war. So, I mean, conceptualize this. The United States is currently engaged in an imperialist war in Iraq where our safety is not threatened at all, really, in any substantive sense. Yet, how many leftists are willing to say we should actively do whatever it is we can do, whether that means smuggling military personnel off bases and creating an underground railroad so they can get out of the country, so they can go AWOL, if that means they should be fragging people, right? What leftist is willing to say we should do whatever it is that we can do to lose this war? And again, this is not the life and death struggle of World War I. And so you have to keep in mind, Lenin is a radical rupture with the Marxism that comes before. He is something fundamentally new. And of course, as he mentioned, right, Lenin is constantly changing his positions, and this is because he's a Marxist. He's a materialist. He believes that there are certain conditions in the world, and that our actions, strangely enough, should mirror these conditions. So you have World War I. They practice revolutionary defeatism. Lenin is in Switzerland. And he says, you know what, this is it. So Lenin begins, gets passage by the Germans on an armored train, comes to the Soviet Union. You have the February Revolution, which the Tsar is forced to abdicate. Lenin is there with his famous peace, land, and bread, right? Peace being an end to the war, land being a redistribution of land from the landed aristocracy to the people who work the land, and bread being food for the cities. And so he comes with peace, land, and bread, and it's moderately successful through the provisional government, which is put together through various liberals like the cadets and the social revolutionaries, which are essentially the Mensheviks, and the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks win a very small amount. But the Bolsheviks managed to get control of two important cities, Petrograd, St. Petersburg, and Moscow. And so they use this power because they control the councils of these cities, of which the provisional government is in St. Petersburg. But across the country, right, they have a very small support. And so what they do is, this is where the famous phrase by Lenin comes, all power to the Soviets. And I will talk a little bit about this before. The Soviets are not the same as the provisional government. This sort of period passes. The provisional government continues the war, right? Because even though it's led by the social revolutionaries, ostensibly a left-wing group, they say, well, we're socialists, and yes, this was started as an imperialist war, but we made obligations to the Western allies that we needed to follow through, and we need to defend Mother Russia, right, against evil Germany, even though we're socialists. And so they continue the war, and they begin an offensive in, I believe, July. And the offensive goes horribly, and it's a slaughter. So Lenin gets the Bolsheviks to try and organize these demonstrations and tries to seize the government. It's an absolute failure. Lenin is forced to flee Russia, and the July days are an absolute failure. The war progresses even worse and worse. Lenin returns in disguise from Finland, where he was in exile, and in October, November by their calendar, advocates once again for the seizure of the state. And of course, all of the other party members know this is ridiculous and it's hopeless. We didn't have enough support to seize them during the July days. What makes you think that we're going to be able to do it in October? But Lenin is insistent, and they do it. They seize the government, they seize the Winter Palace, and this is the October Revolution. So when Leninists talk about the revolution in Russia, they're not talking about the February Revolution, of which the Tsar abdicated. They're talking about the October Revolution, where the Bolsheviks seized the government. Well, essentially, long story short, they fight an incredibly bloody civil war. Rebels, peasants, striking workers who are refusing to create armaments to keep the cities running are brutally suppressed in the name of a policy known as war communism. And again, material conditions. If you're in a state of civil war in which you are literally every side, east, west, north, and south, you have enemy forces plunging at you, the material conditions say, we should do whatever is necessary to ensure the survival of the revolutionary state. And so Lenin does this, and the policy is war communism. It's incredibly brutal. And I'd highly recommend our lecture on the Kronstadt for just one aspect of it. But it's successful. And ultimately, in 1922, all the whites are driven out, all the foreign powers, again, the United States invaded, Great Britain invaded, France invaded, Japan invaded, along with the White Russians, who were seeking to establish essentially an absolutist right-wing dictatorship. Had they been successful, our word for fascism, if I may quote someone I incredibly dislike, had they been successful, our word for fascism would probably be Russian instead of Italian. But the Bolsheviks are successful. Again, the material conditions are then that we need to rebuild the economy. And in this case, Lenin steps back and institutes small market reforms under the new economic policy.